Greetings, fellow truth seekers. Welcome to First Kings. This is lesson 17 in the series. I've entitled the lesson, The Amazing Grace of Yahweh. We plan to cover First Kings 20, verse 1, all the way to verse 43. We actually made it to verse 34, and then at the close of the lesson just read 35 to 43 to sort of set it up for next week. It's a perfect transition, and so what we'll do is I'll read them as we close the lesson today, understanding that I'll pick up there making some comments. So again, the title of the lesson, you're going to see it play out in the lesson, The Amazing Grace of Yahweh. So where we are, just by way of reminder, we are still focused on the northern kingdom under the reign of the wicked king, the very wicked king, Ahab. As I've told you on a couple of occasions, David in the book of Kings is really the gold standard. He is the guy that the writer puts forth as, if you have a heart like David, you're a man who's after God's own heart. And Ahab, who's worse than Jeroboam, as I told you, is like the rust standard. He is most likely the wicked king to ever rule over the nation of Israel. And he indeed is the one that the writer of Kings puts forth as, if you're really a wicked guy, you're like Ahab. So just by way of reminder, last week, the events that we looked at occurred on Mount Carmel, there on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea within the northern empire, the empire of Israel, those 10 northern tribes. We looked at all the events that happened following the amazing event at Mount Carmel when God rained down fire. We saw Elijah prayed. We saw all of those events, and that's really was the focus 2 weeks ago. As Elijah prayed, he saw the rain coming. He sent his servant to warn Ahab to leave the mountain, and Ahab did. And then ultimately, following a 3.5-year drought, following multiple times of Elijah praying, God sent the rain. And we saw that Elijah ran from Mount Carmel all the way to Jezreel, about 17 miles, and actually outran Ahab, who was in a chariot. Now again, there could be multiple reasons, including supernatural, that that's what happened, but just understand that's exactly what happened. And then we saw as Ahab reviewed the events at Mount Carmel with Jezebel. We observed how he removed all of the divine, all of the supernatural, all of the glory and the power of Yahweh from the story and really made it principally almost like what Elijah had done. In fact, we read it this way as he recounted to Jezebel in 1 Kings 19 verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Well, actually, he should have been telling her all that God had done, all that Yahweh had done. That should have been the focus of his story. His recounting really minimized the glory, the majesty, and the power of God. And then equally, he left out how it was the people who helped Elijah execute the false prophets of Baal. And then what we might expect happened next, and that's Jezebel's rage. Verse 2, then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah. So she could have sent someone to kill him. We talked about different reasons why that is, but ultimately we understand Satan's at work. We understand God's sovereignly overseeing. But she sends a messenger to Elijah who says, quote, so may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, these dead prophets, by this time tomorrow. So Jezebel sends this message by messenger to Elijah, and then really the unthinkable happens. Then that's Elijah, was afraid. Now I told you in the Hebrew, the word afraid is not there. It does go on to say in the Hebrew, though, that he rose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. We talked about his servant last week. We see he leaves him there in Beersheba at the end of last week. But we do see he ran for his life, and that's why a lot of translations put fear in there, because clearly if you run for your life, it's because you are afraid. So we watched as Elijah fled from Jezreel and he went to Beersheba. So this was a very long trip. I think it's about 180 miles. He goes not only into Judah, the two southern tribes, but he actually runs to the southern edge of the southern tribes. He is running for his life. He is running from Jezebel, and we talked all about that. We saw he goes another day's journey into the wilderness, even deeper in the Judean wilderness, and maybe even out the other side of it. And ultimately, we saw how God sent an angel and provided food and water and rest for Elijah, ultimately directing Elijah to Mount Horeb, to Mount Sinai, to the mountain of God, where there Elijah would have a fresh encounter with Yahweh. We observed Elijah's deep depression. We talked about reasons for deep depression. We saw how he cried out that God would take his life. We looked at other Bible characters who've said something similar to that. So we spent a great deal of time talking about depression, and we talked about antidotes to depression, all of them found in the scriptures, all of them found in the person of Christ, all of them orchestrated through the power of the Holy Spirit. And we really looked in the text at how God dealt with Elijah's depression and how God put Elijah back on track. At Mount Sinai, along with Elijah, we learned that God had 7,000 who had not bowed and would not bow the knee to Baal. We learned that God had Elijah's replacement, Elisha, already waiting in the wings, already ready to go. So Elijah felt like he was the only one left and they wanted to kill him. But the truth was there were thousands of prophets left, and even his replacement God had already identified. Now, we talked about how God was called not by Elisha was called not by Elijah, but by God. And you and I are ultimately called by God if we're a Christian. We were called by God through the gospel. That's how he called us. We looked at verses that talked about that. And then equally, we saw at the end of our time last week how Elijah threw his mantle on him, that idea that you're to follow me, you're to be my replacement. And we saw that Elisha went to Elijah and said, let me go kiss mom and dad goodbye. He wasn't making an excuse. He was really saying, let me go tell them goodbye because I'm going to follow you to the ends of the earth. We then saw that Elijah held a massive barbecue where he lit the yoke that he was plowing with, and he actually boiled the oxen and used them for food. And so although Elisha is now Elijah's understudy, protege, servant, he's not yet his replacement. And I say that because Elijah's work is not done. God is still busy in the life of Elijah, and although we won't see him in this lesson, we will next week. Now, Elijah had stumbled in his faith. Elijah had taken his eyes off Yahweh. And the truth is, all of us have done that in our journey of faith. If we've been a Christian any amount of time, we've taken our eyes off Christ. And when we do that and start looking at ourselves, we typically become a lot like Elijah. We begin to exaggerate the problems and minimize the glory of God that's at work in our life. But we saw how God called Elijah back. Now, as I thought about this lesson this week, if I didn't know what was coming, let me tell you the 4 things I would have been expecting. Number 1, I would have been expecting for God to sideline Elijah. He lost focus. He ran from his ministry. He's done. That's not how grace works. It's just simply not. And it doesn't work that way, and it's not going to work that way in the life of Elijah. I would have expected Elisha to immediately burst on the scene, but the truth is he's an understudy. He's under instruction. He's learning from a fellow prophet. And so that doesn't work that way either. I'm waiting for God to deal with Ahab and Jezebel. But grace is always more amazing, reflect back to the title of this lesson, than we think or imagine. And God is so patient and kind and long-suffering to wayward sinners. And so it doesn't work that way either. Before I start the lesson, Tony Merida in his commentary on 1 Kings chapter 20 said this, quote, "The whole chapter should cause us to fear God, marvel at his grace, and make us grateful for his word." And that is absolutely true. If you wanted the synopsis of what chapter 20 should move us to do, as we see God at work, it should cause us to fear and to have a reverent awe for the person of Jesus Christ. We should marvel at his grace, that he who knew no sin became sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. And then we should be very grateful that we have his word. We have everything we need as it pertains to life and godliness. And he speaks to us there in his word. And so that sort of sets the table for our lesson this evening as I pick up right where we left off now in chapter 20, verse 1 of 1 Kings. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. Well, wow, this is a clear division in the chapter, right? This is a clear break. So we open chapter 20 all of a sudden talking about a Syrian king. We're not familiar with this king, but we could be familiar with the name. We may remember the name. Now first, the name itself, Ben or Bain in Hebrew, that word means son, and Hadad is a prominent Syrian false god, very similar to Baal. He's the god of thunder. So Ben-Hadad, that means son of Hadad or son of this pagan god. So Ben-Hadad is not his actual name. It's really a title that's used for some of the reigning kings of Syria or Aram, if you prefer the older term. It would be a term like we use president or even Pharaoh. So having said that, earlier in 1 Kings 15, we ran into a Ben-Hadad. In 1 Kings 15:18, he was the son of Tabramon, the son of Hezion. In the passage, if you remember, King Asa of Judah, a good king, makes a treaty with Ben-Hadad so that Ben-Hadad would break his treaty with Israel, who was threatening Judah. Now, we talked about how Asa gave up God's best by working with this pagan general in his army, where God's best was the destruction of Ben-Hadad's army. Because Asa settled for less and entered into a covenant, he got much less. Now history tells us, secular history tells us, that this Ben-Hadad from 1 Kings 15 reigned from 885 BC to 865 BC. Here in 1 Kings 20, we read about another Ben-Hadad. Most scholars believe this is a second Ben-Hadad. In fact, they call him Ben-Hadad the second, and they believe that he is the son to the Ben-Hadad in 1 Kings 15. Now, in this case, once again, there's this strife, and Ben-Hadad is attacking the northern kingdom of Israel, not because he's paid by the southern kingdom of Judah, but because he wants to stir up a fight. He wants some land because he wants to do whatever he wants to do. And Ahab is now king. And so that's where we find ourselves, and that's the Ben-Hadad in question. So let's advance the story. So Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, or Aram, gathered all his army together. 32 kings were with him, and horses and chariots. And he went up and closed in on Samaria, that's the capital city of the northern empire. If you remember, we've talked about that, and he fought against it. So here we're officially introduced to Ben-Hadad, likely the second. We saw that he's gathered his army, fair enough. As you're going to learn in a number of verses from now, the best estimate of his army is greater than 100,000. This is a massive army, and you'll see why. It doesn't tell you directly here, but it will imply it later. And he's accompanied by 32 kings. Now, more than likely, these are tribal lords over different provinces or feudal lords over different areas within his empire. So they're not technically kings like him, but they are political leaders like tribal lords. So he gathers his entire army. He gathers these 32 kings, likely tribal lords over different provinces there in Syria, and he goes up against Samaria, the capital city of the northern empire, and he fights against that capital city. Notice, just by way of passing, the writer of Kings tells us he didn't simply come up with this overwhelming army that I've already mentioned, but he came up with horses and chariots. I mean, if we were trying to convert this to modern vehicles, I guess he came up with assault vehicles and tanks. And so to get this in your mind, the capital of Syria is Damascus. So he leaves this area here, and he travels all the way to Samaria, and there attacks the city, closes in on the city, likely even builds siege walls around the city. Verse 2, and he sent messengers into the city to Ahab, king of Israel, and he said to him, thus says Ben-Hadad, your silver and your gold are mine. Your best wives and children also are mine. So he sends messengers into the city to the king of Israel, to King Ahab in Samaria, and he essentially says, everything is mine. Now this is a command from Ahab to Ben-Hadad to surrender unconditionally, to become a vassal nation to the nation of Syria. This is a command to become subservient and to pay tribute, the nation of Israel, to this pagan nation. Now, as you think about this, just pause for a moment. What should Ahab do? What should he think? Where should he proceed? Well, number one, I think we would all agree he should first and foremost pray to the true and living God, Yahweh, right? James would tell us we have not because we ask not. So obviously he should pray. And then equally, although he's surrounded by armies and horses and chariots, his trust should not be in what the arm of flesh can produce, but his trust should be in Yahweh. In fact, the psalmist said it in Psalm 27. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we will trust in the name of Yahweh our God. So he should have prayed and he should have trusted. At a minimum, we know that. That's like easy spiritual advice, even in the Spiritual 101 class. Verse 4. King Ahab's response. So the word comes, and the king of Israel answered. So Ahab answers Ben-Hadad, and he says, quote, "As you say, my lord, O king, I am yours in all that I have." Now, Ahab did not even appear to think about it. He did not even appear to blink. He quickly capitulated to Ben-Hadad. He quickly committed the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, to serving a pagan nation, to becoming a vassal state, to sending money and even people to this pagan nation. This is unconditional surrender. He didn't even attempt to negotiate conditions. He simply said, yes, we belong to you. Yes, we will pay tribute. Yes, I surrender. He quickly surrendered. He folded like a lawn chair. Now, you know what's funny is you look at how quickly he responded to this demand of this pagan king without even praying. It sure would have been nice if he had responded to the all-powerful God, Yahweh, who rained down fire on Mount Carmel and followed it with rain. It would have been nice if he would have responded to him that way. But there's another thing besides prayer and trust that Ahab should have done, and that was counsel. Right? The writer of Proverbs tells us in Proverbs 15:22, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. He should have sought godly wisdom, godly counsel. He didn't pray, he doesn't trust, and he doesn't seek counsel. He simply just buckles. Verse 5. The messengers came again and said, "Thus says Ben-Hadad, I sent to you saying, Deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children. Nevertheless, I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house and the houses of your servants and lay hands on whatever pleases you and take it away." So on the face, it seems that Ahab folded so quickly that Ben-Hadad ups the ante. Now, it also could have been that Ben-Hadad was simply looking for a fight, and because this didn't generate a fight, like he thought it would have, he just ups the ante. We cannot be sure, but we recognize word comes to Ahab. Ahab sends word back. Now Ben-Hadad sends word back to Ahab. Hearing that Ahab had surrendered unconditionally without so much as any negotiation, he ups the request, and the request is just simply this. This time tomorrow, I'm going to send people into the city, and they're going to pick the things that are pleasing in your sight and drag them off, your wives, your children, your money. Now, Ahab is a childish, petulant, weak, evil toad of a king. But let's be honest, no king is going to agree to this. This ask is impossible. The idea that I'll send my servants into your kingdom and they'll pick whatever you like and bring it out to me, we'll pilfer everything we want and you won't say a word about it. There's probably not a king on earth who would agree to that request. Although we do wonder how Ahab is going to respond. And so that brings us to verse 7. Now, beginning here in verse 7, you'll see that Ahab does one of the things he should have done in the beginning, and that was called together a group of Israel, a group of elders within Israel. Now, these are likely tribal leaders or some type of leadership format that he has there within the northern kingdom, but let's pick up in verse 7. Then the king of Israel called all the elders of the land and said, quote, "Mark now and see how this man is seeking trouble. For he sent to me for my wives and my children and for my silver and my gold, and I did not refuse him." Now the king finally gets around to a scriptural approach, one of the key points, and that was obviously godly counsel. He then, very just bald-faced, recites to them exactly what happened and exactly what he agreed to. He said, hey, I agreed to send him gold, and I agreed to send him some of our people. I agreed to send him money, silver. It's this second part that I can't live with. Verse 8, all the elders and all the people there said to him, "Do not listen or consent." Now, you have to wonder if that would have been their initial advice in the first place. We don't know, but you can definitely see, at least at this point, they encourage Ahab no more. No, do not listen, do not consent. The answer is no. The only thing we wonder, would that have been their answer in the first place? Surely it would have been if they remotely even know Yahweh in the wildest sense. Verse 9. So now the messengers are going to leave Ahab and go back to Ben-Hadad. So he sent the messengers, verse 9, he said to the messengers of Ben-Hadad, "Tell my lord the king, all that you first demanded of your servant I will do, but this thing I cannot do." And the messengers departed and brought him word. So Ahab even reiterates that I'll become a vassal nation. I will unconditionally surrender. I'll send people, I'll send money, but you don't get to pick, you don't get to come in, because we can bet Ahab wasn't sending anything out of his house, right? But this is round 2 in the back and forth, and now the messengers are leaving Ahab and going back to Ben-Hadad. Verse 10. The word comes to Ben-Hadad, and here is Ben-Hadad's response. Ben-Hadad sent to him and said, "The gods do so to me, and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls for all the people who follow me." Now here's essentially what he's saying. We're going to come into Samaria. We're going to level this place. We're going to destroy this place. We're going to convert every block, every stone to sand, to dust, to dirt. We're going to level this place to the ground. So much so that if every one of my soldiers were committed to getting one handful of dirt of what's left of Samaria, there would not be enough dirt to give them a handful. Once I'm finished with you, there'll be nothing left, not even enough handfuls of dirt so that each of my soldiers could get a handful. We're going to devastate this place. Now, clearly we recognize that Ben-Hadad is a bully. He's out here doing what kings often do. He's picking on a weaker nation, and now he's explaining how he's going to simply destroy this place. And so that's round 2 as the word goes back to Ahab. Verse 11. Now this is the only time when Ahab seems, that's the key word, seems to act like a man. This little weenie of a toad king who was willing to surrender without a prayer, without trusting in Yahweh, without any godly counsel, now says something that at first appears bold, but I would argue is extremely foolish for a few different reasons. Verse 11. Then the king of Israel answers. So this is, word has come, word has gone, word has come, word has gone, word has come. Here we go. The king of Israel answers, you tell Ben-Hadad, let not him who straps on his armor boast himself as he who takes it off. Now we get what this means. We might say it this way, in a non-violent way: don't count your chickens before they hatch. Don't sell the bearskin rug before you kill the bear. Don't brag about the boxing gloves as if you were taking them off when you haven't even put them on. So don't brag about the boxing match, So at first it appears to be extremely brave and kind of out of character for Ahab, but it's extremely foolish. Set yourself in the context of the timeline. The nation of Israel has just exited a 3.5-year famine. They are weak. They have no reserves to handle a lengthy siege, much less a lengthy conflict. Equally, At this point in history, Syria is much larger than Israel. Now, the truth is, I mentioned this in class. Well, I didn't plan on talking about it, but because I mentioned it in class, I'll just pass it here. At this point, the army that everyone should have been worried about was the Assyrians. They were on the rise. They were on the increase. And why Syria was picking on the weaker nation Israel when they should have been trying to find nations to go into league together against the Assyrians. But sin is often that way. And so here the nation of Israel extremely weak at a time when they really can't afford a fight. And we have the king saying something that's going to no doubt bring about contention, anger, and almost guarantee that there's a fight coming. In fact, the writer of Proverbs said it this way in Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Now, anyone with any Bible sense understands that what you did in this threat is you're not going to cause him to stand down. What you've done, what you're going to do is fire him up. You're going to stir up wrath in him. And so we understand, we have good spiritual insight of what's about to happen. Verse 12, when Ben-Hadad heard this message, as he was drinking with the kings in the booths, he said to his men, take your positions. And they took their positions against the city. So a couple of quick observations here as you think about this. Obviously, the armor comment enraged the pagan king. But again, we recognize Proverbs 15:1 had already told us it would. Number two, we recognize Ben-Hadad's lack of concern, even respect for the armies of Israel, or for the God of Israel for that matter. He sees them as nobody. He sees them as grasshoppers. And you can see that because he's on the battlefield in a foreign country. They set up booths, no doubt, where the generals, the lords, the kings, and the big king are living. And they're in these booths drinking it up. And so from this position, he's giving commands. It's almost like we're fighting a nation that doesn't even deserve my attention. He has a total disregard for the army of Israel or for the God of Israel. And then thirdly, we see Ben-Hadad's lack of discipline in the battlefield. This is outrageous. No seasoned general would ever take any fight, regardless of how small it might be, with this much disdain and lack of concern. And so we see here he is in these temporary shelters that they've erected in the field of battle in a foreign country, and he's getting drunk in the middle of the day with the other 32 lords, those other princes. Again, he has no fear of the nation of Israel, no fear of their God, but he's not extremely wise either. Now, if pretend you've never read this story for just a minute. At this point, my expectation is, yep, wicked Ahab is about to get his clock cleaned. Jezebel may be following. They have sown the wind. They're about to reap a whirlwind. I'm expecting the judgment of God to fall. In all honesty, I feel like it's sort of overdue for Ahab, and I realize that's not how God feels. And so God forgive me for when I read these stories going there, because you are a merciful, kind, and patient God. Verse 13, and behold, a prophet came near to Ahab, king of Israel, and said, then from nowhere, no one's prayed for Yahweh to send word, to send help, to do anything, and behold, a prophet, an unnamed prophet, an unknown possibly prophet, but definitely unnamed prophet of Yahweh comes near to Ahab. So picture this, Ben-Hadad and Ahab have been sending their messengers back and forth. Now Yahweh sends his messenger. Where the king was, we don't know. Who the prophet is, we don't know. We recognize God sent him, and we recognize there's no indication that Ahab asked for him. That is the amazing grace of God. This is God stepping into Ahab's disaster. And Ahab never even bothered to ask. That is our loving, kind, patient, compassionate, grace-filled God. Verse 13b. Thus says Yahweh, have you seen all the great multitude? We know Ahab has seen the great multitude. They're surrounding the city. This is a rhetorical question. This is like God asking through the prophet a question for effect. Ahab, have you seen the multitude? Better than 100,000 that wraps around this city, and you're only going to be able to generate, as we will see, thousands in response, not even 10,000. But then he says this, then the prophet says this, behold, I will give it into your hand this day, and you shall know that I am Lord, I am Yahweh. He tells Ahab, I will give you the victory over this innumerable company, this grace, or this great multitude, and this is grace upon grace. They have not prayed for it. They haven't asked for it. They don't deserve it. And the reason is so that you will know that I am Yahweh. And you know, this has been Yahweh's goal over and over again here in 1 Kings. We've seen it multiple times. 1 Kings 8:6, 8:43, 18:37. God is doing this so that the nation would know that he is the true and living God. Now, if you spend some time in the Old Testament, you'll find this idea of that you may know that I am Yahweh is featured in the books of Ezekiel and in Exodus. Just Google the phrase. This idea that I'm doing what I'm doing, whether it's with Israel or whether it's with Judah. I'm doing what I'm doing so that you will know that I am Yahweh. And that's God's goal even today. He does what he does so that men and women might know that Jesus is Lord. Verse 14, we can picture this like, you're going to love this picture. And Ahab says to the prophet, by whom? In other words, who's going to deliver this great army? The prophet says, thus says Yahweh, by the servants of the governors of the district. Then he said, who shall begin the battle? And he answered, you. This is almost comical. So Ahab begins us with a question, who's going to deliver this multitude? And in my mind, I'm thinking SEAL Team 6, that's not the answer. The Lord responds, you'll love this, the servants of the governors of the districts. So the governors of the districts are more than likely the elders of Israel who had been called there and who he has been communicating with and getting advice about this, letting them ransack the city. And what this prophet tells him is it won't be the governors of the districts, it will be their servants, the servants who came with them. This is the JV team. This is nobodies. This is an army like Gideon. And by the way, this word translated servant is the word that's often translated boy or lad. He could have said, who's going to deliver you are those teenagers who are serving the governors of the district who are there giving you advice. That's who's going to do it. And I would just remind us, as you think about just how impossible that's going to be, God always chooses the foolish things to shame the wise. He always chooses the weak things to bring to nothing the things that believe they're strong. So having heard it's the JV squad that's going to do it, Ahab says, okay, well, who's going to start the battle? And the prophet looks at him square in the eye and said, you. And I suppose it seems almost comical. I suppose it is, but the sovereign of the universe can use anything and often does to accomplish his will. He uses us. Verse 15, then he mustered the servants of the governors of the district, and there were 232. And after them, he mustered all the people of Israel, 7,000. So these were more than likely fighting men, not all the people in general. So he mustered these 232 who Yahweh had said he was going to bring the deliverance by. And I kind of feel like, we don't know, the writer of Kings doesn't tell us, but it's almost like he said, I need a little more than this. But he musters some more people, and it turns out to be 7,000. But here's really the crazy part. This man just a few verses ago was willing to surrender unconditionally without so much as firing a shot or even making a counter offer. And here in just a few verses, he's willing to fight. Now, likely, as we talked about in the class, I think it was Matt, he had nothing to lose at this point. He was likely willing to give Yahweh a shot because he had no other shots. Now, you don't hear me say much positive about Ahab, but here at least he steps into his God-given role. He musters up and he delivers. He gets these 232. He ultimately gets the 7,000 and he sends them out. And based on some things we'll read here in a little while, we learn that there's probably more than 100,000 troops that day with Ben-Hadad. And so Ahab musters 232 plus 7,000. That's 7,232 who are going to go out against greater than 100,000. And so just one last question. Let's pretend these were all the fighting men and teenagers that you could muster up. I don't know that I would send them all out of the city, but that's exactly what Ahab did. So let's see what happens. Verse 16. And they went out at noon, so they're going out of the city. You can picture these like just 7,232 people exiting the city. While Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the booze, he and the 32 kings who helped him. So there's this big 33-person party. It's the middle of the day. They're getting hammered. He's already stationed people around the city. We read about that. He's already got lookouts looking at the city. And so now there's these 7,232 that are slipping out of the city. Now what's interesting is Ahab has taken counsel from Yahweh, by the way, non-solicited, but he at least is following it. And Ben-Hadad is taking courage from strong drink. I think you can guess how this is going to play out. They're in the booze getting hammered, verse 17. The servants of the governors of the district went out first. So the 232 go out first. And Ben-Hadad sent out scouts. And they reported to him, hey, men are coming out of Samaria. So the servants of the governors go out first. Ben-Hadad has his scouts already out there, and they report back to Ben-Hadad, hey, men are coming out of Samaria. Now, he's not likely expecting Rangers of SEAL Team 6. He's likely expecting a peace envoy, especially if it's just a couple hundred people, and that's all that have come out at this point. At least according to the writer of Kings, that's all that have come out. And even if the 7,000 have come out, it's not enough for him to be worried. He's probably thinking a peace envoy. Who knows what he's thinking? Verse 18. And he says, if they come out for peace, and that's he, Ben-Hadad, come out for peace, take them alive. Or if they've come out for war, take them alive. Now, maybe that's his plan. I don't know that taking people alive who are putting up a fight is really the way you want to go. Or if that's the alcohol speaking. I don't know if he's just stammering on his words. We can't be sure. But we do understand that's what he said. And I would argue that it's hard to take people alive who are putting up a fight. Now, as one of the, I think it was Matt mentioned in Sunday school, maybe quite possibly what it was is, he was saying, hey, hurt them, but don't kill them. We don't know. So whether it was the alcohol talking or whatever it was, we understand what he said, though. Verse 19, so these went out of the city, the servants of the governors of the districts, and the army that followed them. So the army is definitely, if they weren't already, they are there. The 7,232 are out on the battlefield. The odds are overwhelming. They've all left the city, not what's recommended in any warfare hang guide. And they're now going out to fight against the Syrians, and the Syrians have the command to take them alive. Verse 20. And each struck down his man. Now, what that sounds like, and God uses economy of speech, so sometimes we're not positive, but it sounds like each one of these 7,232 people killed at least one Syrian. They all went out and whacked somebody. And this caused such a fear in the Syrians that they fled and Israel pursued them. But Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, escaped on a horse with horsemen. And the king of Israel went out and struck the horses and the chariots and struck the Syrians with a great blow. So whether or not there were multiple waves of fighting, we don't know. We just know that as the writer of Kings explains, it's almost like these 7,000 struck down, a man each. And in seeing this happen, the Syrians, because the sovereign of the universe does as he pleases, they flee. Ben-Hadad, although half tanked, is able to get on a horse with other horsemen, and he flees. Now, all of this finally gets the king of Israel out on the battlefield to show some gumption, where he goes out and strikes the horses and the chariots, and ultimately the Syrians are struck with a great blow. So Ahab goes out and strikes them down, and he's, the hero of the story, but the hero of the story is God. He stepped in the middle of this and brought great victory Now, he did bring it through their efforts, and that's a good application for us. God can do anything that he wants, but most of the time, he chooses to work and do the things he wants to do through us. He desires to use us to accomplish his will and his glory. He doesn't need us. He doesn't have to have us. He's not hamstrung if he doesn't get us, but he will use us for his glory. And here is a story where God graciously intervenes, and I mean graciously, and Israel is given an amazing victory, one they did not ask for and one they did not deserve. Now I want to pause the story right there and say something. This is a beautiful picture of the gospel. Like Ahab, God stepped in and informed us via prophecies that he would bring a great victory on our behalf. And then his son came into the world and executed that great victory in a most unlikely way. He died on a rough, rugged cross in our place. He bore our sins. He bore the wrath of God. So the victory was won, not in this case for us, not with a group of young servants, but with the suffering servant, the Lord Jesus Christ. And I would remind you, we did not ask for it and we did not deserve it. That's the gospel, and that's grace. Verse 22. Then the prophet came near the king of Israel and said to him, "Come, strengthen yourself and consider well what you will do, for in the spring the king of Syria will come up against you." So this unnamed prophet comes to Ahab and he says to him, here again we see God's grace. Ahab doesn't even appear to be thankful or repentant or anything. This is like more amazing grace. And he says, hey, strengthen yourself, fortify yourself, consider well what you're about to do, for the king of Syria will come back. Now, when he was saying consider well, I think what he was saying is not think about how you might fortify your armies, but rather consider well about how you need to submit yourself to Yahweh God. That's what I think his driving point was. And you see what he says, consider well, for the king of Syria will come back. He will return in the spring. So Ahab, this wicked, evil king, is once again assisted by God, all with one intent, that God is showing himself to be the true and living God. He is showing himself to be Yahweh. And that brings us to our next verse, verses 23. So now we're led on a little inner office communication, a little back channel chatter from high command between the soldiers and Syrian high command. Or maybe we're just let in on a little back chatter as people try to justify and explain why such a massive army suffered such a humiliating defeat. Verse 23. And the servants of the kings of Syria said to him, the servants of the king of Syria said to him, their gods are the gods of hills, and so they were stronger than we, but let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they. So as they've reflected on all this, they tell the king, we got routed because of geography. You see, the geography, which was hilly because Samaria was a city built on a hill, favored their God, where the plains favor our God. And so if we were to take them on in the plains, our God would help us be victorious. We need to stay away from the mountains. Now, truthfully, because of the horses and chariots, I would have recommended they go to war in the plains, but that's neither here nor there. Forget my recommendation. Let's just keep walking with theirs. This does highlight a couple of things, though. They have a complete misunderstanding about Israel. Israel was the nation that served the one true and living God. But let's be honest, and this came up after the Sunday school class, and it was by Bill, but let's be honest. There were so many false shrines and so many Asherah poles. There were so many pagan idols throughout the land of Israel that anyone observing the 10 northern tribes would have thought they worshiped multiple gods. So although they supposedly didn't, by this time, the nation, not every person in the nation, but many in the nation did. Now, it's possible, as you think about the gods of the mountains, that they had heard stories about Mount Sinai and about Mount Carmel, and so maybe they are thinking Yahweh's a God of the mountains. And it's also interesting that they had credited their success or lack thereof to the gods. But in all this, they made a fundamental error. And by the way, it's one I see made quite often in believers and unbelievers. They thought too little of Yahweh. They chalked up their failure to accidentally fighting on the mountains because they were dealing with a God who was limited. They saw the gods of Israel as gods who were limited, and Yahweh is anything but limited. And that brings me to just a point of application. Do we really believe that God can do anything? Can heal anyone? Can turn around any situation? I mean, do we really believe that? You see, because the truth is sometimes and I know you, can have a small view of our awesome God. And we can be just like the pagans and begin to think too little of our mighty God. Verse 24 and 5. Do this, O king Ben-Hadad. Remove the kings. So get rid of those 32 feudal lords who you were drinking it up with. They're not very good for us. Remove them from their post and put commanders, army people, much better, in their places. And muster an army like the army that you have lost. So we can imagine the army we're going to read about is similar to what he had lost. Horse for horse and chariot for chariot. Then we will fight against them in the plain. And surely we will be stronger than they. And he listened to their voice and did so. So more back chatter. They've given him recommendations. Get rid of the kings. They were just getting you drunk anyway. Muster up an army similar to what you had. And then we're going to go take them on in the plains and we will whip them. That's their point. Ben-Hadad listens to their voice. So we should imagine that what the prophet has already told Ahab is definitely going to come true. The Syrians are coming back in the spring. And we should imagine that they're not going to come to Samaria. They're not coming to the city that's built on a hill. Verse 26. In the spring, Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Ephek to fight against Israel. So springtime comes, the time when kings go out to war. It's the weather that's conducive best to living out in the open fields. And we see the Syrians under Ben-Hadad do not go to Samaria, the city built on a hill. They engage Israel instead at Ephek. Sorry, I didn't advance the verse. So Ephek is located here, slightly south of Samaria. And they pick a large city, but one that's in the plain. They probably begin to lay their armies around the city, recognizing that will call out the nation of Israel to fight against them. Verse 27. And again, they came from Damascus and the surrounding area. The Damascus is the capital of Aram, or the capital of Syria. Picking up in verse 27, and the people of Israel were mustered and were provisioned and went against them. So he musters his army as best he can, he being Ahab, but he knew this was coming. The prophet had told him. And the people of Israel encamped before them like two little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. So Israel comes out against the Syrians, and the writer of Kings tells us they look like two little flocks of goats, while the Syrians filled the entire land. A complete mismatch again. Verse 28. And a man of God came near. Man of God. Another man. This is probably a different person altogether. A man of God came near and said to the king of Israel, thus says Yahweh. Because the Syrians have said Yahweh is a God of the hills, but he's not a God of the valleys, therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Here God does it again. Amazing grace. He sends a man with a word, but it's more than just a word. It's amazing grace times amazing grace. Once again, I am going to deliver this great multitude into your hand, that you will know, that your people will know, that this will finally be settled. I couldn't settle it at Mount Carmel. I couldn't settle it with the rain. I couldn't settle it the last time with Ben-Hadad. But this time, you and your people will know that I am the true and living God. I am Yahweh. And so Yahweh says, because they believe Yahweh's a limited God, I'm going to show you and them that Yahweh is an absolute unlimited God. And again, this is God's amazing grace being extended. This is God's desire that people would know him in a true and meaningful and life-changing way. Now, there's something I do want to say here, and I briefly said it in class, and I'll be brief here. I often hear people say, the God of the Old Testament is vengeful and wrathful and angry, and Jesus is nice and full of grace. And they just seem like two different gods. Like the Father's much different than the Son. The Father's very angry and filled with wrath and vengeance, and the Son is very compassionate and kind and long-suffering. That is absolutely, well, I'll say two things to that. Number one, that understanding is a very superficial reading of the Old Testament. For when we really work through the stories of the Old Testament, what we see over and over and over and over is a patient, long-suffering God. A God who's not willing that people should perish. A God who's willing to go extra miles to show himself to be God that they would call out to him. But I would remind you, it's a superficial reading of the New Testament too. Because I would remind you of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. Struck them dead. Total lie. You see, God is a patient, long-suffering God, but there's no warning in the Old Testament or the New when that long-suffering ends. Which means God is a God not to be trifled with. Because that's where men get doomed to destruction, by trifling. And again, we recognize he's a sovereign God. He can step in whenever he wants. He can extend grace and extend grace and extend grace. And we see this sovereign God always doing it that people might know that he is the true and living God. Verse 29. So they encamped opposite one another for 7 days. This must have been magical. It must have been like the little two flocks of goats practically surrounded. But then on the seventh day, the battle was adjoined, and the people of Israel struck down the Syrians, 100,000 foot soldiers, in 1 day. Now, number one, this encamping against each other, we see this in armies in antiquity, if you remember when David took down Goliath. But for 7 days, they're encamped against each other, and finally, the little two flocks of Israel go against the Syrians, and in 1 day strike down 100,000 foot soldiers. God has chosen the foolish things of the world. God has chosen the weak things of the world, right? Here it is again. This is a massive defeat again. 100,000 dying in 1 day, and keep in mind this army we're told was going to be similar to the first one. So this is another major army, except here we know 100,000 have died right this day. This would have been devastating to the Syrians. This would have been a massive defeat on the battlefield. Unless they had 1 million soldiers, this would have been a huge loss. We recognize right now that the two little flocks of goats probably didn't deliver themselves, but God through them brought the victory, and we've all already made application to that point, God working through us, so I won't say it again, other than just to remind you. Verse 30, and the rest, that's the rest of the army of Ben-Hadad, fled into the city of Aphek. So the city of Aphek, likely a walled city, as you'll see why in a second. And so they went into that city. They're probably thinking we can fight there. We can defend ourselves there. We can maybe hold this city for a good long time. And picking up back in verse 30, they flee into the city of Aphek, and the wall fell upon 27,000 men who were left. Ben-Hadad also fled and entered an inner chamber in the city. So now they've lost 127,000 men in 1 day. This is probably nearly all the force they have. And the last 27,000 were lost supernaturally as a wall fell on them, a wall they were probably hiding behind and using for protection, and wiped out 27,000 in 1 day. You know, it's funny, I told the class we often sing songs about Joshua fighting the battle of Jericho, but here it was, I guess we could say Ahab, but it was really just like Jericho, Yahweh fighting the battle of Aphek. And we see these 27,000 Syrian soldiers die. And again, we see sometimes God simply fights our battles for us. And that's a great point of application. Just like David took down Goliath, just like God delivered up Ben-Hadad, it is our David, the Lord Jesus Christ, who takes down our greatest foe, sin and death. Further, we see that Ben-Hadad enters the inner chamber in the city. Now, this was some well-protected room within the city, and he enters this, no doubt, for protection. Verse 31. And his servants, that would have been Ben-Hadad's servants, likely soldiers, present a plan to Ben-Hadad, a way that they're thinking they can get out of this with their life. And you see what they say. His servants say to him, behold, we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. Let us put on sackcloth around our waist and ropes on our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare our life. Now, we don't know where they heard the kings were merciful. We're not sure how they got that word, but fair enough, that's what they think. And they recognize that it's probably best if we take off our military attire. It's best if the king strips off his royal garments and we put on sackcloth and put ropes on our head. Sackcloth, no doubt, signifying their penitence, and ropes signifying their submission, the willingness to be led around by a rope by Ahab and to his army. So in doing this, they're hoping that their lives will be spared. And let's be honest, they have no other plan, so it seems like a reasonable plan. Verse 32, so they tied sackcloth around their waist and put ropes on their heads, and they went to the king of Israel and said, your servant Ben-Hadad says, please let me live. So we can picture this. They no doubt come out of the city of Ephek, out onto the field of battle. They have sackcloth on, they have ropes on their head. Likely their hands are up, they're not wearing any weapons. And they tell the men, Ben-Hadad says, please let me live. Now notice they were taking directly to the king of Israel. So they presented themselves and they took them, and the soldiers took them directly to the king of Israel, who, as we'll see in a minute, was standing in his battle chariot. So there he is, the royal king in his weapon of warfare, and these rebels against Yahweh and against his kingdom are brought before him with this message, your servant Ben-Hadad says, please let me live. So that's what's going down. What will Ahab do? Here's what he says. Does he still live? He is my brother. Now this is a picture of judgment. This is a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ, the King of the universe, ready to execute judgment on those who've rejected him and rejected his kingdom and rejected his way. And here, face to face in this human picture, the king of Israel, Ahab, when he gets the message that Ben-Hadad is alive and wants to continue living, he says, oh, is he still alive? He's my brother. Does he still live? Oh, praise the Lord, he's alive. He's my brother. This evil, wicked king views this other king who's been seeking to destroy his kingdom, seeking to rob his kingdom, seeking to take women and children from his kingdom as his brother. He has some kind of bizarre love, adoration, I don't know, for this other pagan king. He says, oh, thank God he's alive. He's my brother. Sometimes we read things in the scriptures that leave us speechless. This indeed is one of them. Ben-Hadad was not Ahab's brother. He was the enemy of Israel. This is a man who's been threatening to drag off women and children, who's been threatening to rob the nation. He's twice invaded the land. But let's be honest, he's as pagan as Ahab, or Ahab's as pagan as him, so maybe they are in some kind of strange way cosmic brothers. Verse 33, now the men, that's the men who had turned themselves in, the men who had left Aphek and delivered the message, the men were watching for a sign. And they quickly took it up from him and said, yes, 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 your brother Ben-Hadad, he is alive. Then he said, go and bring him. So picture this in your mind. They're looking for a sign. Ahab says these things. They like, oh yeah, we've got it. They are merciful. They're going to be kind. So they quickly go, yeah, your brother Ben-Hadad, he is alive. Then he said, go get him. Now think in your mind what should happen next. When they parade Ben-Hadad up to the king of Israel, Ahab, standing on his war chariot, what should happen next is the unsheathing of his sword and the burying it in the heart of the enemy of God, the heart who has twice threatened the nation of Israel. Ahab says, go and bring him. Verse 33b, then Ben-Hadad came out, so you can imagine him coming out of Aphek, being taken across the battlefield, ultimately being brought to where Ahab is on his battle chariot. Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he, that's Ahab, caused him, that's Ben-Hadad, to come up into his chariot. So they escorted Ben-Hadad in sackcloth with a rope around his head out to the king, standing on his chariot. And what we read next is shocking. Ahab extends his hand and invites this enemy of righteousness into the chariot with him. This is to provide this pagan king a place of honor, a place equal to the standing of the king of Israel. This is to put Ben-Hadad in equal footing with Ahab, the king of Israel. This is a reminder we should never be unequally yoked in any condition. And he has just made, he's going to do it more. He's going to more yoke himself. But this is absolutely ridiculous. It's insane. It is evil. Verse 34. Ben-Hadad says to Ahab, the cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars or markets for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And Ahab said, I will let you go on these terms. So he made a covenant with him and let him go. So Ben-Hadad steps out up in the chariot. I can imagine in my mind Ahab's helping him up. And then Ben-Hadad, shrewd diplomatic genius, we might say, he says, hey, my dad stole a bunch of cities from you. I'm going to give them back. And, my dad set up bazaars in Samaria after some fighting, your dad. I'm going to let you set up your street market, sell your wares in Damascus. So he says, hey, what we can do is, you can, sell goods in Damascus. I'm good with that. And so that's where we find the story. And then you see Ahab made a covenant with Ben-Hadad and let him go. You're free. These terms are fine. I agree. So many things come to mind. Obviously, never be unequally yoked with unbelievers. He should have never entered a covenant with a pagan nation. He hasn't prayed about it. He hasn't sought godly counsel. He hasn't done anything. And then equally, as I told the class, and I'm not sure how it came up, but I'll say it here. Whenever we make a deal with the devil, we are always the junior partner. And guess what? Ahab is the junior partner. Ahab has given him the farm with nothing in return. What Ahab should have done, if not plunged the sword in his heart, is prayed and said, Yahweh, would you like me to plunge the sword in this man's heart? But instead, he lets him go completely. And that brings us to verse 35. Now, as we come to 35 through 43, we have a story that you will not find included in any children's Bible. It's unlikely you've ever heard a sermon on this story, but it's the Word of God. It contains a key message, and it really puts this whole story together. So what I'm going to do is exactly what I did in class. Just sort of read it, maybe make a couple little comments, but save it until we get back together next week. So all this has happened. We can picture that the forces of Syria are withdrawing under Ben-Hadad, who's been allowed to walk, verse 35. And a certain man of the sons of the prophets. So here we have another prophet, and we're now learning that there's like a school of the prophets, and this man is a son of the group of prophets. And he says to a fellow, likely another prophet, he says to a fellow at the command of Yahweh, strike me, please. So he looks at this guy and says, Yahweh has commanded you to strike me. But the man, who is also a prophet, as best we can tell, refused to strike him. So this one prophet says, Yahweh says to strike me, because there's an object lesson that Yahweh wants to teach. And the other prophet says, no, I will not do. And so I will not do that. And we recognize the seriousness of one prophet not doing what the word of God says, but we'll save that discussion when we get together. Verse 36, then he said to him, because you've not obeyed the voice of Yahweh, behold, as soon as you have gone from me, a line shall strike you down. As soon as he had departed from him, a line met him and struck him down. We'll talk about that. He disobeyed, judgment was executed. Verse 37, then he, that's this son of a prophet, found another man, like this son of a prophet, another prophet, and he said, strike me. In other words, he said, Yahweh has told you to strike me. And the man struck him. He struck him and wounded him, just as Yahweh had commanded. So the prophet then departed and waited for the king, that's Ahab, by the way. He had disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. So he now has got a puffy face with a bandage. He looks like a man who's been in a fight, because he has been. He looks like he's been on the field of battle, and he's disguised himself. So obviously the king probably knows this prophet. He knows who he is, and this prophet has disguised himself. Verse 39, as the king passed, he cried to the king and said, your servant went out in the midst of the battle. So I'm out there in the battle, and behold, a soldier turned and brought me a man, a captured man, and said to me, guard this man. If by any means he's missing, your life shall be required for his life, or else you'll have to pay an enormous amount of money back then, a talent of silver. So I'm out there during the battle, and a soldier comes up and says, hey, watch this Syrian guy, and if you let him get away, either your life for his life, or you'll have to pay an amount of money you don't have. Verse 40. And your servant was busy here and there, and I looked back and he was gone. See, what a ridiculous story. I've had an enemy turned over to me, but I'm busy with stuff. I don't have time to pay attention to him. I look back and he's gone. Now, the king doesn't even let him say anything else. The king of Israel says to him, he interrupts his story. He's heard enough now. And he says, so shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. You yourself have declared it. Then he hurried to take the bandage away from his eyes. And the king of Israel immediately recognized him as one of the prophets. And then the prophet said to the king, verse 42, thus says Yahweh, because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I, Yahweh, devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And then the king of Israel went to his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. We'll pick up the story right back then as we make some comments about this next week and about all the key points that we should take away from this next week. But you see, this is another Nathan and David story. This is where the prophet does something, and then the king pronounces his own judgment on the matter, and his own judgment condemns him, for he was the one who had let escape the one who Yahweh had devoted to destruction. 4 quick lessons from 1 Kings, just to wrap it up for today. Let's avoid the folly of both of these two kings. Drunkenness, greed, violence, injustice, ungratefulness, faithlessness, all of these things, both of these kings represent everything we should not be as we walk with Christ. Number 2, let's marvel at God's grace, for he showed it over and over and over again to Ahab, a wretch just like you and I. Now, maybe he's just not just like us, he's a lot like us, or we're a lot like him, however you like to say it. Let's live in view of God's unlimited power. These 2 victories were humanly impossible. And then finally, let's take the Word of God seriously. We'll develop that point next week. But I submit unto you, 1 Kings chapter 20, everything but the last few verses. We'll pick this up, Lord willing, next week and move right into chapter 21 and see grace once again to a man who did not deserve it, does not deserve it, and proves even more so he doesn't deserve it. We'll see grace is extended once again. Until we meet again in Sunday school class or here on YouTube, God bless you.